Now you might have heard me mention Cycles before because this is a different render engine that you can choose to use. And it's much more photorealistic and is in fact the one that I chose to use for the Trident animation. So we're going to go ahead and learn how to use that one on top of Blender Render. So this is how you use it for Blender Render. We're going to go ahead and go into Cycles and try to change up the materials to fit that engine, but keep all the aesthetic the same. So let's go ahead and hit Escape, go back into the 3D viewport, and change this up here from Blender Render to Cycles Render. This should change up everything to be solid because it doesn't use the same material setup as Blender Render. So we're going to go ahead and hit Use Nodes here. As you can see, the stained glass material is now blank essentially. So we're going to go ahead and hit Use Nodes, which will give us just a simple diffuse. So we're going to go ahead and hit Control left arrow, and that will bring us to the compositing workspace, but we mostly want it for the material node editor. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this pink globe here in the compositor, or the node editor I should say, up here, and that should give us, let me go ahead and go into the camera view real quick, that should give us a good view of what the stained glass material nodes look like. And there we go. If you just zoom out a little bit, or you can press home to zoom in on the nodes that are already in the workspace. So we have here a very basic cycle shader, which is the BSDF. This is a shader node, and this is the output node. So very simple, very easy to understand. But what we want is a diffuse mixed with a transparency, all driven by a texture. So I'm going to go ahead and try to only use the menus on the right, but I'm going to leave the window in the middle open so you can understand how the node editor works, because it's very powerful. But it can be intimidating at first. So this should help ease you into it. So we're going to start off by going to the surface subsection of the stained glass cycle shader, which is under the materials tab, and change diffuse to mix shader. This will allow us to mix two shaders together, as you can see here and here. And I'm going to go ahead and start with the transparent shader because of course we want it to have some transparency. And then we're going to create the other shader, which is a diffuse, which is the basic matte color. And we're going to go ahead and make sure the diffuse is driven by a texture, which is going to simply be done by going to the color section underneath diffuse and then clicking that little dot next to it. That will, I gotta scroll up a bit, that will give us an image texture option, and then go to the drop down here next to the open button over here and go ahead and select Minopolis exported RGBA.png. So that will give us, obviously, as you can see here, actual textures again, which is great. But before we do that, we need to remember it's going to be interpolated unless we do something special, because that's the default setting. So we don't want it to interpolate because we don't want it to be blurry. So we're going to go ahead and select this linear option underneath color and under the image texture options and change linear to closest. This does the same thing as changing the turning off the interpolation and changing the filter to box over in Blender Render. It achieves the same thing, but this is for cycles. Now let's go ahead and hit Shift Z while our mouse is hovering over the viewport, just so we can get a preview render in the viewport, which is faster than a normal render using F12 that Cycles allows you to do, as well as Blender Render, but this is nicer in Cycles. And as you can see here, we have sort of a thing where I think everything is sort of transparent. Well, the reason is because our mix node is actually just at 0.5 for the factor, which means that it's evenly blending between 100% diffused and 100% transparent, which means almost everything is just going to be 50% diffused and 50% transparent. So we don't want that. We want it to be driven by a texture. So in order to fix that, we're going to go ahead and just go next to this factor option underneath the mix shader and click that dot right there, and that will give us an image texture option, which will then go to the drop down and select Minopolis exported alpha.png. This will allow us to use that alpha PNG to actually drive the transparency intensity for different parts of the texture. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and hit Shift Z. And I know it looks white, but that's just because you have that texture selected, so it biases whichever texture you have active in the node editor for which one is viewable in the viewport. As you can see here, we have a pretty nice representation of what we want. The stained glass is there, it's transparent. It's a little dark and a little hard to see, but it's definitely there. And the fence looks fantastic, very sharp, very clear, and there's still an attachment to this concrete over here. So Real quick, I'm going to notice that this is actually not in closest, so I'm going to switch this linear over to closest real quick. And there we go. That should make the opacity or the transparency also just as sharp in terms of the pixelation of the texture. That should be it. Let's go ahead and double check and see how our other windows are doing, shall we? I feel like I'm baking a cake or something. But as you can see here, we do have all these other windows that are working just fine. But it looks fine. It looks fantastic, and that should be enough to create any kind of Minecraft world that you want to make in both Blender Internal Render and Cycles Render Engine. I hope you found this helpful, and in the next video we're going to talk about downloading the pre-made Minecraft assets that are available for the community to use for Blender for free, and how to use those assets, how to skin your own character. So I'll see you guys soon.